Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Experts Podcast, where we bring you practical advice on how to transform your business to be sustainable. I'm your host, Vanessa Thompson, and in this episode, we're covering carbon removal with our distinguished guest, Tito Jankowski. Jankowski is the co-founder of AirMiners, an incubator for carbon removal ventures and technologies. Tito, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, nice to be here.
Well, I wanted to just give some context to our audience, and then I'll ask you your response at any of these statistics. So I'd like to start out with three statistics. The first one is 10 billion. We have to remove 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year to hit our 2050 target, 28%. Companies that invest in carbon removal have 28% higher revenues than those that don't, and this is mainly from customer demand for responsible business practices. $100. It takes $100 to $600 in terms of cost to remove 1 ton of carbon. And we're hoping that advancements in this technology can get us down to $20 by 2050. I also wanted to just define for our audience the difference between decarbonization and carbon removal. Decarbonization is where you're actually reducing your emissions or implementing a project that will actually reduce how much you're polluting. Whereas carbon removal is once carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, drawing it down in a way that's safe. So, Tito, I know you're joining us from COP29 in Azerbaijan, just getting back to San Francisco. And this summit has been, a top conference for world leaders when it comes to climate. But before we kind of get into that conference, which I know is really exciting, do you have any kind of initial thoughts to these three statistics or what's happening in the industry in large?
Yeah, totally. So the three statistics really paint this picture that emerges from that, right? Right. It's kind of like when you paint a painting, you've got red, green, and blue, and you put them all
Mhm.
together, and here's this image that
Yeah.
appears. So 10 billion tons per year. That's the overwhelming consensus from climate scientists. That's been the
Mhm.
IPCC reports since 2018 and again 2023. 28% higher revenues. I didn't know that. That sounds really cool. $100 per ton up, and above. The cool thing that emerges is when you look at, we need 10 billion tons per year removed. Models look like $100 per ton in that 2050 time period. That's $1 trillion market.
Wow.
That's the image that emerges there. Carbon removal to hit those climate targets needs to grow as fast as the computing industry ever has, as
Mm.
fast as the solar industry ever has, as fast as biotech ever has. And that's really what we're talking about when we say carbon removal. It's this new piece of the climate puzzle that, for decades, all we needed to do was to decarbonize, was to reduce emissions. And then there was this big report in 2018 from the IPCC that said decarbonization alone wasn't enough. So we still need
Yeah.
all the wind and the solar and the reductions. We also need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's already there. And that's what carbon removal is all about. And that's how big it needs to get.
Yeah. And how do we scale the carbon removal industry at the rate that it needs to reach some of these climate targets?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of what we work on at AirMiners really is how do we get to these billion-ton targets by accelerating innovation, creating new startup companies, figuring out how to fund them, figuring out how to scale them so that we can actually remove the amount of carbon dioxide that we need to.
Well, it's a really cool venture. And also the COP29 conference as well has been carbon removal has been a huge topic within that, as well as climate finance. So your incubator plays a huge role in that. What are some of the insights that you've gotten from the conference? What was it like?
The big takeaway from Baku was, this theme of this is a carbon market conference this year. And that's because going into this, there was kind of always this idea that, well, maybe there'll be a global market for carbon. But it was
Yeah.
very much a if. And what happened this year is with the approval of Article 6.4 and the movement on these kind of foundational global agreements for carbon markets, what we now have is carbon markets have gone from a if to a when. And so
Mm.
that is a massive shift when I think about the companies that are those 28% higher revenue companies that are already investing and already participating in carbon removal.
Yeah.
All of that foundation shifts from, maybe this is going to happen to, okay, when's it going to happen? And that's really what
Mm.
where things are shifting now. And that's an opportunity for companies, for investors, for people buying carbon removal credits, for people starting all these carbon removal companies. It's even an opportunity for countries to start to become carbon removal producers and participants in this market. And so that's a massive shift. This whole negotiation has been going on for 9 years, and now
Wow.
we have that 9 years under the umbrella of maybe this will happen. Is this an if? Now it's okay. This is a real thing, and there's plenty of details to still get sorted out. But what's on the horizon is you can start to see, even countries starting to position to say, okay, we want to support innovation, we want to support
Mhm.
improvements in this stuff so that we can be leaders here.
Yeah. What do you think has really driven that shift at the conference? Now we're starting to talk about when all of these things will happen. Who are really the people who are leading the forefront and leaders who are coming to the conference who are really changing that conversation?
Yeah, I would really say it's the shift that uh I've been to COP the last 2 years, but I was talking with
Mhm.
people about, what have they seen as the trend line over the last couple of years. And really it's that, at the heart of these the Conference of Parties meetings, which are part of the United Nations organization, the heart of those are these global negotiations. So there's
Mhm.
a room of negotiators that are working out these policies. That's always been the
Mhm.
heart of what this conference is about, is what happens at this conference. And what's the trend line though, while that's remained consistent, right? The negotiations continue.
Mhm.
But what's changed over time is there is this larger layer of kind of business and innovation
Mhm.
and finance that's around the negotiations. And so the way that people talk about it is there's the blue zone, which is that's where the negotiators are. That's where you need to be either part of a nonprofit group or
Right.
on behalf of a nonprofit group or one of the parties that's negotiating. But then there's also the green zone. The green zone is that's really where businesses are presenting startup pitches. McKinsey has a giant booth, or big, energy companies have big booths, or wind and solar and battery companies are all there. And that's really the biggest shift over the years has been this explosion
Mhm.
of the green zone, in that sense of, these negotiations start out as here's the structure, here's the framework for how we get the planet balanced. And
Yeah.
then the green zone really represents that interface to the rest of the world, where it's like, okay, how are we going to actually take these things forward? And again, the Article 6 piece that I was talking about this year, that's really moving from, this idea of climate science, where we need to have a carbon market, where we need to remove carbon, now into, well, there's this agreement that we need a carbon market, and here's how it might work. So really, that the leadership starts from the negotiators and the agreements they make, and it kind of then blossoms out into the green zone and beyond.
That's wonderful. And in that green zone, what innovations are you most excited about? People that you got to talk with or different technologies that you came across that just seem really inspiring and exciting.
Yeah, I got to be at a pitch competition that was hosted in the Green Zone, and I got to see three of our startup accelerator graduates
Oh,
pitch. So that was
wow.
awesome. We had
Incredible.
Samudra, Hive Geo, and Rewind. Rewind's not a graduate, but they've started to go through our negotiations program that we have, and they were pitching for, how to take carbon dioxide out of the air in different ways, whether it's in
Mhm.
seaweed, in algae. Another one's taking wood waste and storing it for a long period of time. And just seeing these different, I mean, a couple of years ago, each of those ideas that I mentioned, it's funny to think about it. Each of those would have been totally on the fringe, even of carbon removal, of like, what? Why the heck would you do that? Why would you take seaweed and process it so that you can remove carbon dioxide? And yet that's where the leading edge of carbon removal is, in pursuit of how do we hit these scientific goals of these climate goals of 10 billion tons per year by 2050.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you see a lot of investment and capital coming to these organizations as well, too, in terms of seeing a lot of excitement going to COP, 29 to hopefully invest in some of these technologies as well?
Yeah, so we've had 187 companies graduate from our program. They've raised $139 million and counting to
Wow.
date. That's on venture, that's on grants. And it's a really, it's a terrific start. There's investment funds like Lower Carbon Capital that has their dedicated $350 million fund that's just for carbon removal. There's Counteract that has about $100 million. There's Carbon Removal Partners that has about $50 million. And these funds are all really aimed at carbon removal. And the challenge is, though, given the need for growth or the opportunity for growth, with the kind of investor sentiment right now is, how would I say this? It'll be interesting to see what happens by the time this episode is published. And there is a pullback on early stage investment for carbon removal. And what it means
Mhm.
is it means that we're in a position where just in terms of the progress that needs to be made in terms of iteration, in terms of science and technology, that
Right.
that the current path is we lose some of those companies. We lose some of the innovations and some of the innovations that we need to get on track for even targets as close as 2030. And the
Mhm.
risk is, if we start missing for that and we miss for 2030, then we're really off track for 2050, and we don't have a way for carbon removal to get to the scale that it needs to avert these worst impacts of climate change, to avert the
Yeah.
the the drought, the famine, the migrations, the war, all those things really we can't get around those without carbon removal. And because that, I mean, to go back to why are we talking about carbon removal? It's because decarbonization alone doesn't get us to 2 degrees of warming.
Right.
There's no model for decarbonization alone that keeps us at 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees of warming. And so it really is this necessary piece to avert the worst impacts. And so what's possible is we see a real rise in investment and seeing carbon rule as an opportunity. Mentioning this Article 6 shift for having even countries seeing this as an opportunity. We just had the Wall
Mhm.
Street Journal report about carbon rule yesterday. Really, that's it's possible that turns into a whole wave of investment. Really seeing this as this $1 trillion opportunity, and that investors say, okay, look, this is something I want to get in on the ground floor of. That's
Yeah.
where we've been, participating already. We raised a fund about a year ago, and we've made 20 investments. So we're all in on carbon removal,
Right.
and looking to see others jumping in.
Yeah, and what kind of investors are particularly looking at this sector? Because it is a really visionary investor that I think goes into carbon removal, mainly because, the benefits are somewhat, long term. And also there's not a lot of awareness of carbon removal kind of over traditional decarbonization efforts. And so there's a lot of investment in clean tech for decarbonization, but not necessarily for carbon removal. What are kind of the leading investors, and kind of who are they, and what kind of mindset do they come into when really looking at some of these startups?
Yeah, there's two types of investors. One are venture investors, and two are kind of more corporate investors. And I'll start with the corporate investors, because I think that paints really the picture of what's happening in carbon removal. So, for
Mm,
example, companies like Stripe and Shopify have been investing in carbon removal and purchasing carbon
mm,
removal credits. Those are tech companies, finance companies, companies like McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group as consulting companies. Mitsubishi, a giant Japanese
mm.
conglomerate in heavy industrial company, also investing in carbon removal and participating in the market. And so I think the what emerges there is, why the heck are they doing that? And what I'm seeing is they're doing this because it's really aligned with one, their values, and two, it's
Mhm.
really aligned with their the potential growth of their core business. When you think about the growth of financial markets, when you think about the growth of consulting markets, when you think about the growth of project development, um, you can look at this $1 trillion opportunity as, wow, this is something that we can actually be part of the foundation for it, in terms of how transactions happen, in terms of how these projects get built, in terms of
Mhm.
how the Fortune 2000 learn about what carbon removal is. And so you see a lot of corporations participating in that way, where it's aligned with their carbon goals, it's aligned with their climate
Mhm.
goals, and it's also an opportunity for their business. The second group is venture, and that's where you have, Chris Sacca, for example, is the founding partner of Lower Carbon Capital, famous venture capital investor who was on Shark Tank.
Hmm.
and now has this $350 million carbon removal fund. And so I think for the venture world, it's really kind of following that thesis where it's, look,
Hmm.
you do the climate math, 10 billion tons per year by 2050, something like $100 a ton, trillion-dollar market. Let's go be a part of unlocking that and unleashing that whole market. And so whether it's
Yeah.
venture investors or kind of corporates that are investing, that's really the images that's coming there. I guess I'd say that the third investor are governments. The U.S. government has been a massive investor in carbon removal.
Hmm.
$3.5 billion has been allocated towards carbon removal in the United States, primarily direct air capture, which is one method of carbon removal. But they're also doing pre-purchases of other types of carbon removal credits like biochar, enhanced rock weathering, ocean-based carbon removal. And these are all just different ways of removing carbon from the sky. But yeah, the government's also a massive investor in carbon removal.
Any advice that you'd have for some of the businesses listening into this on how to develop their carbon removal strategy? Because decarbonization is kind of front of mind. So if they're starting to think about, okay, carbon removal needs to be part of my strategy, how should they be thinking about that? Either if they want to engage with carbon removal or they also want to invest in carbon removal ventures. What should they be thinking about kind of front of mind as they start to go down that path?
Great. Yeah, I would say I liked your stats at the beginning, kind of this, here's a stat and it opens up this whole image. Here's a stat that I'm seeing is that the leading corporations in this space they're making plans to be eventually their sustainability targets will be 100% carbon removal. So they won't be doing anything with carbon offsets or carbon reductions. And so why is that happening or something like that? I think that's something for people to kind of uh, go look into that. But just in the sense that that's where corporate sustainable leaders are making their plans for is, and eventually where we've decarbonized our supply chains, where we've bought carbon reduction credits for a while, but eventually that picture would be 100% removals. And so that's all towards that 10 billion tons removed per year by
Right.
2050. Um, the other thing I would say is that when you hear carbon removal, a lot of people think direct air capture. They think these
Right.
machines that grab onto carbon, they kind of look like giant vacuum machines.
Hmm.
And from a strategic standpoint, it's really important to know that direct air capture it's just one type of carbon removal. Through our accelerator program, we've worked with 187 companies. We've got people working with farmers to take farm waste and turn that into solid carbon. We've got people that are farming seaweed out in the ocean and turning that into solid carbon. We've got people that are grinding up rocks in Brazil, for example, and using those as carbon sponges for removing carbon dioxide from the air. So there's all these
Mm.
different types of approaches, all these ways to
Yeah.
soak up carbon dioxide, and that's really what carbon removal is all about. It includes direct air capture, of course, but that's just one method for carbon removal. The third thing I would point out is that carbon removal can be an opportunity for the core business. So we're looking at, for
Mhm.
example, I mentioned grinding up rocks. Mining companies are seeing carbon removal as an opportunity to, in that sense, do good while doing good. In the
Mm.
sense that rocks are really good sponges for carbon dioxide. Well, great. Mining companies have access to the rocks. They have access to
Right.
grinding the rocks, to transporting the rocks, all these things that need to happen in order to turn those mines into carbon removal solutions. And
Mm.
that's an opportunity for those mines. And it doesn't end with that. And again, carbon removal touches agriculture, mining, manufacturing, all these giant industries.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity for those industries to actually contribute to removing carbon dioxide from the sky. And so for your listeners, I encourage them to, as they're listening to the rest of this discussion, really think about, how is this something that could help me with my goals, whether those are sustainability goals or their revenue goals, right? Imagine going to your CFO and saying, hey, you know how I usually show up and we have these sustainability programs that require money? I've found something that's actually going to make us a lot of money or could make us a lot of money instead. That's a game changer, right? And so I encourage
Yeah.
everybody in this discussion to consider that. How might this, solve some of the challenges that you're seeing from a sustainability standpoint, from a revenue standpoint?
Absolutely. And it's true not just with carbon removal, but so many different sustainability programs where it's either reducing costs or increasing revenue or, potentially even a new revenue stream in many cases as well too for businesses. There's so many great opportunities out there. Which kind of leads me to just asking you also about AirMiners. I know we talked about the conference a bit, but I would love to talk a little bit more about AirMiners. You have this great program, this great accelerator for startups. I would love if you could just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly. So AirMiners exists to figure out how do we hit these targets for carbon removal. Our specific goal is 1 billion tons removed by 2030, which
Wow.
unlocks us for that 10 billion tons per year by 2050. And so, of course, we have an accelerator program. Of course, we do educational programs. Of course, we have a fund, all those things, because in a world where the innovation doesn't exist and the pathways to 10 billion tons per year don't exist, well, then of course we need a bunch of startups. Of course, we need to unleash a whole generation of new ideas, of innovation,
Mhm.
of trying things, of scaling things. Everything that AirMiners does really translates back to that.
Mhm.
So our accelerator program started 3 years ago. We've accelerated 187 companies from all over the world, working on all sorts of different methods of carbon removal, and they've raised $139 million and counting. And that's really been the impact of the accelerator to date. They've sold. We had one company just on the cover of the New York Times. Actually, I've got this here.
Wow.
This is Carbon Run, our graduate. This is their method for it improves river health, it improves the health of fish and fishing, and it removes carbon at the same time. And they were just on the cover of the New York Times during the first week of Climate Week because they had sold $25 million of carbon removal credits to a group called Frontier, that is a corporate consortium of companies that are all buying carbon removal credits and supporting the creation of this new market.
Wow.
And so that's, those are the types of outcomes we're seeing from our accelerator just 3 years in.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. And I would imagine that a lot of these are also very early stage startups as well too. What kind of development are some of at least the early graduates from your program? What stage are they at? Are businesses able to start purchasing some carbon credits from these organizations, or how are they kind of developing?
Yeah, we work with really early stage companies. Generally, it's, two people in a dream. They've got an idea and a prototype. Like I'm thinking about starting to work with Carbon Run that was on the cover of the New York Times. We met them, gosh, maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It was
Wow.
just, they were starting to think about, okay, this is we want to make this a company. We want to get this thing started. How do we do that? And so
Hmm.
AirMiners is really it's really an ecosystem for everybody that's out to figure out how to remove billions of tons of carbon from the sky. We've got over 2,800 members worldwide on our Slack channel. We do online events. We do, like I mentioned, a fund. We have investors demo day as part of our accelerator, buyers demo day as part of our accelerator. We bring in investors, bring in buyers, and say, look, here's what these companies are up to. Here's how you can invest in them. Here's how you can purchase from them. So if there's anybody in your audience that's interested in either investing or buying carbon removal credits, we have opportunities for them to connect, and they can go on our website, or they can email me and get looped into those things. But that's really where we're engaging, are these companies that are going to go on to be the leaders in carbon removal. And that's the whole
Wow.
point, is to
Yeah.
create that.
And in terms of scaling as well, too, a lot of these businesses need to scale really rapidly. What are the challenges that you see for a lot of these businesses to be able to scale to meet the challenges ahead for the planet?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is on the demand side. So and what that means is the biggest challenge is we're selling invisible gas. It's
Hmm.
expensive. It's hard to keep track of it. Hey, do you want some? It's really
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, how do we actually establish this from the demand side? On the other side of which, of course, there's scientific consensus that we need 10 billion tons to be removed. And so,
Hmm.
so the gap right now is, how do we actually scale up on the demand side? So we've had, early companies like Microsoft, Stripe, and Shopify have committed about $3 billion to purchasing carbon
Wow.
removal credits. And the question really is, well, where's the next wave of that?
Mhm.
Where are the next buyers coming from? And so one of the things that AirMiners has done is we've created a buyer's academy. So you can kind of think of it like, well, there's a
Wow.
startup accelerator for startups, and we're creating a buyer's academy to support corporate sustainability leaders who want to make carbon removal part of their strategy, or who want to
Mm.
invest into carbon removal. And so it's accessible to anybody around the world. We run it online, like all of our other programs. But that's where we're seeing is there's a gap. There's kind of question marks around, okay, where's the next piece of this come from? And that's what we're working on growing with our Buyers Academy. We're also creating a new buyers club. We're helping buyers actually kind of create their own portfolio, make their own purchases of
Hmm.
carbon removal and their own investments of carbon removal to get that firsthand experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add on to that, in terms of pricing as well, too, I mean, I had that one statistic, it's $100 to $600 cost to remove 1 ton of carbon. Is that an accurate statistic, or what are you seeing in terms of pricing per ton of carbon? And are you hoping that, comes down quickly?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a huge range right now. I mean, everything
Mm.
from $100 to for certain types of solutions to $600. There's others that are, I mean, at the prototype stage, they're saying, hey, look, if you want this carbon, it's $1,000 a ton. That's
Okay.
just what it is. There's a model out from Bloomberg NEF, which is Bloomberg's sustainability arm, and
Mhm.
they're modeling that prices for carbon removal fall to about $100 per ton by 2050. And so that's the target when we're working with our
Okay.
startups and we're educating buyers about the Buyers Academy. It's really saying, look, long term, this is $100, but if we don't actually pay higher prices in the beginning, then these technologies aren't going to be in place to then be able
Okay.
to lower the prices over the longer term. So it really is about creating this kind of innovation pathway to how do we iterate and improve and get the price down and the amount of removals way up.
Well, I wanted to kind of wrap up with just, a few questions. And one of them is for COP30, where do you hope we are in terms of carbon removal, as well as just what you've seen from the conference this year? What are you looking forward to for COP30, and where do you think we need to be?
Sure. I think that by COP30, I would love to see countries moving forward on making carbon removal a revenue stream for those countries, part of their economy. The G7 is coming up in Alberta, Canada, in a couple months, and would love to see that be part of the spotlight for Canada, saying, look, this is something we see as a massive opportunity.
Mhm.
Japan is already stepping forward on that with they've upgraded their emission trading program to include carbon removal. They're the first to do that, and would love to see more wins like that on a country level coming into COP30. Because really unlocking that whole theme for at the country level. I'd love to see an emphasis on carbon removal at COP30. There was people talking about doing a whole pavilion about carbon removal in
Yeah.
Brazil at COP30 when that comes up. Yeah, so that's kind of the big country level vision, and then all the way down to what's actually going to be happening on the ground at COP30. I would love carbon removal to be part of every conversation at COP30, every booth at COP30, in the blue zone, in the green zone, anywhere that we're aiming for a stable climate. Carbon removal is now required,
Yeah.
and so therefore it just makes sense to make carbon removal part of every discussion that's already part of decarbonization,
Yeah.
include carbon removal.
Yeah. And also, do you have any last advice for our audience, particularly the business leaders in our audience, in terms of how to engage with carbon removal, how could they can engage with, COP30, hopefully? Yeah, any last kind of words of wisdom that you want to leave to them thinking about this conversation?
Yeah, two things that AirMiners can support on is we have our Buyers Academy that I mentioned already, and you can check that out on the AirMiners website. And that's for corporate sustainability leaders specifically who are looking at buying carbon removal and want to know more about this market. We also have our AirMiners Boot Up, which is it's an online program. It's 6 weeks long. It's free. And it's really for anybody that's curious about carbon removal. We match you up with a handful of other people, kind of like you. They're like, hey, we're curious about this too. It's kind of a book club style where you're all going through the materials and learning about different types of carbon removal. And you kind of divide and conquer. And one person reads one article, one person listens to a podcast, somebody else watches a video, and then you come together twice a week and share, well, what do you think about this stuff? Is this working for you? Is this what questions do you have? And so that's AirMiners Boot Up. We've had 1,000 people graduate. And those people go on to be sustainability leaders in their corporations. Some people start companies. Some people go on to work for policy or for the government. But that's really a place where people who are curious about carbon removal become those change makers. So those are two touch points where people can take their next step on carbon removal. You can also attend. We have online AirMiners events about every month. We have a YouTube channel with over 100 of those events that we've recorded. So I always like to think about, in terms of next steps, like here's places you can go and things you can connect with for your next step.
Perfect. Great. That was my next question, which is where do they find you online and how do they support you?
So if anybody'd like to get in touch with me, you can obviously check out our website, airminers.com. And my email is tito@airminers.com. So TITO@AIRMINERS.com. And would love to hear from you.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, great being here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Experts. If you liked the insights from our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on our website. We produce episodes with world-class executives every month and offer exclusive consulting and speaking services globally. Reach out to us and become a leader in your industry.